Hello everybody and welcome to Region Lock. Region Lock is a new show from Censored Gaming, and every 2 weeks on Wednesdays we're going to be taking a look at the latest current events in how video games are changed around the world. And so what's currently being planned is that in future all videos will be published every other Wednesday at 6 PM Eastern Time. However, with this being the first episode, I didn't want to have to wait till the next Wednesday to publish it. And so you'll be able to catch the next video on the 21st of April and then every 2 weeks on Wednesdays following that. And again, 6 PM Eastern Time. And what I'm planning on doing is making use of the YouTube Premiere feature. And so this means if you get there when the video is first published, it will be a little like a live stream. And we'll have the chat room features open and so on and so forth. And so yeah, this is going to be a new thing for Censored Gaming. And it's going to be similar to all of the other channels' content, but because there's just so much that goes on, this will allow me to talk about more things. And so hopefully this is something that some people are going to be interested in. Also, something else I had planned for these videos is that at the end, we're going to have a sort of questions and answers from you guys. And so if you have anything you want to ask, perhaps about myself or the channel's previous videos, or any information and details about the sorts of things that the channel covers, feel free to send in your questions in the comment section, and there's a chance that they can be featured in a future video. But of course, please understand that I won't be able to answer everything. And so then, first things first, we're going to be taking a look at Disco Elysium, the final cut, which is something that Censored Gaming made a video about recently, explaining why the game has been refused classification in Australia, which means that the game is effectively banned for sale in the country. The game was refused classification in the country due to what was described as drug use related to incentives or rewards. And this refers to a number of items in the game, one being called Speed Saint Baptiste Peptide and the other Speed Bottle, which were found to bear too many similarities to drugs seen in the real world. And because their usage within the game was seen as a incentive or a reward, this is something that Australia is very strict about, and so the game has been banned. Now, Disco Elysium, the final cut, released worldwide on March 30th. And of course, with the game being refused classification in Australia, it wasn't expected to see a release at all in Australia without making changes to the game. And this is something that the developers have continued to remain silent on and haven't commented on the Australian decision. However, on March 30th, Australian gamers found themselves with a rather nice surprise, as across all PC storefronts, the game somehow still managed to release in the country. It hasn't been listed on the PlayStation Store, likely won't, but for all PC platforms such as Steam, GOG, and the Epic Store, Disco Elysium, the final cut, released in Australia and still to this day is still available. Now, it's not really known what's going to happen here, and it's very possible that it may get taken down at a later point. Also, for some further context on this, Disco Elysium was previously already available in Australia on PC storefronts. It was only with the updated Final Cut release that the game was submitted to the Australian Classification Board for a rating, which then led to the game being refused classification. And also now on PC storefronts, the original vanilla version of Disco Elysium is no longer available, and you can only find the Final Cut version. And so perhaps because it was already available, and then the Final Cut version came as a free update for the base game, perhaps this has something to do with the game currently still being available on PC storefronts. And again, it isn't, on the other hand, available on the PlayStation Store. And then sticking with Disco Elysium, the final cut, you may recall from our previous video how the Australian Classification Board's decision to refuse the title for a classification hasn't come without controversy. This is something that was being reported by even the non-gaming mainstream media, and also the Australian Interactive Games and Entertainment Association ended up making a statement about it, criticising the classification board for refusing the title for a rating. And also speaking about the double standards in terms of how games are treated in comparison to all other forms of media. Now, following this, there have been other prominent figures over in Australia speaking out about the decision. And one of these was featured in an opinion piece over on GameIndustry.biz. The article is from Lee Harris, who speaks about his experience working in the industry, with him for the first few years of his career working in PR at Rockstar Games. And this is during the time where games like Grand Theft Auto Vice City and Manhunt were also facing a lot of censorship issues in Australia. And basically the article is him expressing his point of view of having submitted over 100 games for classification in Australia and how Disco Elysium's ban represents a long-running problem. But he then concludes the article with the point of view that publishers should not be editing games for Australia. He says, "What I want to say to developers and publishers concerned about the Australian market is this. Don't edit your games to accommodate these guidelines. It's still a relatively small market. You can afford it. Make the beautiful, wonderful visions you set out to make, and if your work causes another Disco Elysium debacle, it'll be worth it." It results in headlines like this over at The Guardian that keeps the pressure on. It pushes people to bring our classification system up to speed with the rest of the developed world. And then he says, for more on what needs changing, check out this submission by the IGEA. And so this article, which was also titled "Don't Edit Your Games for Australia," is putting forward the point of view that if publishers and developers accommodate Australia's guidelines by editing their games to fit in with their classification standards, not only will they not be creating the games that they truly want to create, but that this may also delay the classification board modernizing their standards so that it's more comparable to what is seen with other forms of media like movies. And then next up, we have a quick update on a video that Censored Gaming made a while back now on the PlayStation reportedly losing popularity over in Japan. And this video was based on a big article that the website Bloomberg put out, where they were contacted by a number of insiders working at PlayStation, as well as getting in touch with an analyst, and they reported on a variety of happenings in the way that Sony is running their business, and certain decisions that they're making, which is causing some of the Japanese public, as well as the game developers, to feel sidelined. Now, Bloomberg is of course not a gaming website. It is a very big mainstream outlet that is quite authoritative and is also very much focused on the business side of things. And so Bloomberg putting out this article was quite significant. And whilst the article spoke about a wide variety of things, one of the things that was mentioned is how Japan-based developer support teams have been reduced by as much as a third from their peak, and the rolling contracts of a number of game creators at PlayStation's Japan studio haven't been renewed. And that the US office believes the PlayStation business doesn't need games that only do well in Japan. And at the time, with this article being published last November, this information was being relayed to Bloomberg from insiders who are either former or current employees. However, fast forwarding things to the present and the point about the rolling contracts of a number of game creators at PlayStation Japan Studios not being renewed is something that recently got put in the forefront of conversation when Sony announced that Japan Studio was being downsized, so that from here on out they will only be working on games in the Astro's Playroom series. Now, Japan Studio was PlayStation's in-house development studio, and following its creation way back in 1993, has been responsible for many classic and popular Japanese games released for PlayStation systems. And so this was definitely news that a lot of gamers found quite sad and unfortunate, and it also mirrors what we were hearing in the Bloomberg article last November. However, Sony's announcement came at the end of February, and things haven't ended there. Since then, we have been hearing from more and more key figures within Japan Studio announcing their departure from the company. This includes Kentaro Motomura, who was a producer on Bloodborne who has worked at Sony for nearly 2 decades, on titles like Wild Arms, Dark Cloud, Rogue Galaxy, and Everybody's Golf. Then there's Shunsuke Saito, who was an art director, character designer, and animator for the Gravity Rush series. Then there's Yasutaka Asakura, who was an executive producer for games like Shadow of the Colossus, The Last Guardian, and Demon's Souls. And also Gavin Moore, who was the Demon's Souls remake director and has been at Sony for 24 years. However, these departure announcements are only the most recent in a big wave of departures within the company. But to move on from that and onto some additional info that came up in the recent interview Censored Gaming covered from the newly translated Star Fox interview. Now, this interview was originally carried out way back in 2002, but it's only just been translated into English by the website shootemuplations.com. And from this interview, Censored Gaming recently made a video that spoke about the character Crystal and Miyamoto's, as well as character designer Imamura's, inspiration for the character Crystal, as well as touching upon how it was revealed that Miyamoto has apparently always envisioned Star Fox as being a more mature franchise, and mature in the sense that it's more designed for older audiences. However, there was another interesting detail that came up in this interview that's also very relevant to what we do at Censored Gaming, and this is in relation to the character Andros, who is the main villain in the Star Fox series. In the interview, Imamura speaks about having to change Andros's name for the overseas version. In the Japanese versions of the game, Andros is instead called Andorf. However, Imamura says that this had to be changed in the West due to him being told that the name was too similar to Adolf. And so he says that he came up with the name Andros instead, and then afterwards he thought to himself that he wishes he came up with that name in the beginning so that the versions could be unified. And then the interviewer also asks whether the Japanese name Andorf was actually supposed to be derived from the term Andromeda, to which Imamura confirms and says that's correct. Next up, we have some news on loot boxes and how over in the UK it looks like they will soon be facing regulation from the UK government. Now, loot boxes and them potentially being very similar to gambling is something that has been getting discussed a lot over the past few years, and we've also started to see different countries begin to introduce varying levels of regulation. Now, the recent UK news is in relation to an upcoming review of the UK's Gambling Act. The Gambling Act will soon be updated, and last December the UK government published their terms of reference and calls for evidence. Here the government discussed how some have called for loot boxes to be classified as gambling, and they then explained that they will be gathering specific evidence before making the decision. And they also put out a call for evidence to help support them with the review of the Gambling Act. This is something that has already been discussed by the UK's House of Lords, however, last July, with them themselves coming to the conclusion that loot boxes should be regulated and treated as gambling. However, with the review of the Gambling Act putting out a call for evidence, this has then prompted Gamble Aware, who are a UK charity who aim to reduce gambling-related harms in the country, to commission a study which has been carried out by the universities of Plymouth and Wolverhampton. The study set out to explore any possible links between video game loot boxes and problem gambling. And amongst their findings, they have found that around 5% of loot box buyers perhaps generate around half of industry loot box revenue, with almost a third of them falling into the problem gambler category. The research also found that younger males and those with a lower educational attainment are more likely to purchase loot boxes. And they also established that links between loot box purchasing and problem gambling have been robustly verified in around a dozen studies. And the report then suggests that games with loot boxes should be clearly labelled and have enforceable age ratings. They should also have full disclosure of odds, spending limits, and prices in real currency. And so, following the results of this study being published on April 2nd, this is something that got widely reported by the media and both gaming and non-gaming. And with the study being carried out specifically due to the government's call for evidence for the upcoming gambling review, it seems that when the Gambling Act review comes into effect later in the year, that loot boxes are going to be included in its regulations. However, what exactly the regulations will be is something that we can't know for sure until the review is published later in the year. Alongside this, there have been some further loot box developments on April 6th over in Brazil. It was announced that Brazilian authorities have launched an inquiry aimed at banning loot boxes in the country. This being on the recommendation of the National Association of Child and Adolescent Defense Centers. This is something that the Brazilian government are still looking into, but should the ban be approved, Brazil is considering introducing fines for companies selling loot boxes at a daily rate of up to $700,000. Whilst loot boxes are something that are definitely very controversial amongst gamers, something we have seen with some countries that have introduced regulation are games being made completely unavailable rather than just removing the loot box-like mechanics. For instance, Belgium announced in 2018 that loot box systems have been found to fall under Belgian gambling laws, and that if they weren't removed, publishers could face legal proceedings and fines of up to 800,000 euros. Following this, numerous publishers announced their decision to close down many games in Belgium, with this including companies like Square Enix and their games Mobius Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts Union Cross, and Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, as well as companies like Nintendo and games like Animal Crossing Pocket Camp and Fire Emblem Heroes, with Nintendo also saying that any future Nintendo games with similar earning models will no longer be released in Belgium. And then next up is some recent tweets made by Yuzo Koshiro, who is a famous Japanese video game composer who's made the soundtracks for many popular video game franchises. He's also the CEO of Ancient, who have developed many different games since its creation in 1990. One of the games developed by Ancient is the classic side-scrolling beat-em-up Streets of Rage 2, and Streets of Rage 2 is what these tweets are concerning. And in the tweets, Yuzo has shared an interesting fact that he received back in 1992 from Sega of America. The fax message is regarding some early artwork that Sega of America had been sent for Streets of Rage 2. And the fax message is titled Characters in Streets of Rage 2, and it's dated May 4th, 1992. And it says, "We have some serious concerns about the characters in Streets of Rage 2. As this is planned to be the number 2 title for the year after Sonic, it's extremely important to Sega of America. Sammy, the 12-year-old black kid with rollerblades, looked like a white kid in the drawings you sent on paper. It is important he look like a tough black street kid, as in the photos I sent you. The photos you sent off the screenshots look fairly good, but we will also look at the demo you sent over this week for Boca Raton. Blaze, we have come up with a tough, sexy look for Blaze, which we are using for a cardboard stand-up, a life-size image of the 4 characters. This will be displayed in stores. Can the character Blaze in the game look like this? Her style of clothes and look is very popular here in the US right now. She will have a black top and short denim jeans. Max, the handkerchief on Max's head needs to be removed. He looks too much like Hulk Hogan. Many people have commented on this. This change must be made to avoid legal problems. Thanks for your help." And so this is quite an interesting behind-the-scenes glimpse of Streets of Rage 2. But that's not all. A few days later, Yuzo found the sketches he had sent in to Sega of America. And so with these, we can see what Sega of America received, which then prompted the fax. And taking a look at the sketches, we can see that Axel doesn't look too different from how he's depicted in the final version of the game. For Blaze, on the other hand, she's looking a little different, with her wearing a different top, for example. But then Sammy is also looking very similar to how he looks in the final version of the game. But Yuzo has given a little extra information about this, saying, "Sammy was described as a black kid in the proposal from the beginning. I think we first sent rough designs as they were to Sega of America, since the fax machines at the time had less capability to show crisp black colors." But then moving on to the sketch of Max, and we can see Max sporting a very different design. And for instance, like the fax said, he is wearing a handkerchief around his head, which he doesn't in the game. But yes, apparently Sega of America was concerned that he looked too much like Hulk Hogan, which then seems to have prompted the design change in all versions of the game worldwide. He also isn't wearing pants in this version, comparable to how a lot of wrestlers dress, whereas in the final version of the game he does. And in regards to what the fax said about Blaze and changing her clothes to a black top and short denim jeans, this didn't happen to the game itself, and like the fax said, this was for a store display cardboard stand-up of the characters. However, the look that was mentioned in the fax is very similar to the way Blaze is depicted on the cover art for the American version of the game. Here Blaze looks very different to how she does in the game, whilst on the Japanese cover, on the other hand, she looks much more similar to how she does in game. Also, just in case there's any possible confusion, when the game was released outside of Japan, it had the name changed to Streets of Rage, with the series over in Japan being known instead as Bare Knuckle. But then lastly, we have some new video game imports that support English language options, but are exclusive to the Asia region. However, one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes things can change later down the line, and Western releases can suddenly get announced. And so for instance, first up we have Aria Chronicle. Now this is a game that's available on PC via Steam worldwide. However, so far the Switch release seems to be a Japan exclusive, but it fully supports English language options. The game is a Korean turn-based RPG, and PlayAsia has just opened up pre-orders, with it expected to ship July 8th. And of course, Censored Gaming is a PlayAsia partner, and PlayAsia is the biggest import specialist in the world. And so if you ever want to pick up anything from Asia and Japan, PlayAsia is definitely somewhere that you might want to check out. And also there will be links to the games mentioned in the description, and if you use our links and the discount code Censored at checkout, you'll be helping to support the channel and we'll be able to save 5% off every order. And so there's also Earth Defense Force World Brothers for PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. Now this is a game that seems to be digital only in the West, and it's also releasing May 27th. In the Asia region, however, it is instead releasing April 30th, and so nearly a whole month earlier. It's also releasing physically, unlike over in the West, and fully supports English. Alongside that, it's just been announced that Legend of Mana and the remastered release is getting a physical release in Asia with full English language options. This also seems to be digital only in the West, and it's expected to ship June 24th for both PS4 and Nintendo Switch. Alongside that, there's the visual novel Islands for the Nintendo Switch. Now this again fully supports English, and over in the West it appears to be digital only. It's also just been released, with its release date being April 8th. And then lastly is Blaster Master Zero Trilogy. Now this is quite a big fan favourite, and the trilogy release has currently not been announced for a Western release at all. The individual games in the trilogy, however, have been, with the third game in the series coming later this year. The individual games, however, are digital only, aside from a very limited print run of the first two games last year, and the upcoming third release appears to be digital only as well. However, not only is this release a trilogy package, which contains all previous DLC, but as a special bonus for this trilogy package, the first two games will be featuring new voice acting. And so this release is something that's very much in demand, and it's expected to ship July 29th for both Nintendo Switch and PS4. And the Asia release again fully supports English. And so, as I mentioned at the start of the video, I think it could be cool to have a sort of questions and answers at the end of these videos. And so, like I said, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and there's a chance that they can be featured in a future video. And so guys, until next time, thank you for watching.